Well, thank you very much, Bill and Michelle, for your presentations this afternoon about Hispanic Catholicism. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to concentrate my remarks, my response, precisely on the findings of this particular survey, vis-a-vis Hispanic Catholics in the United States. And I will say, as a matter of fact, the lens through which I'm reading the data and the analysis provided to us in the articles that you already have in the National Catholic Reporter is through the question, how can this data, which is important for us to understand where we are today in terms of Catholicism, helps the church in this country to better serve Hispanic Catholics. So my response is going to be brief. I'm just going to divide my remarks in 3 moments. First of all, I'll just look at some of the insights from this 5th National Survey of American Catholics that I think that are helpful to better understand Latinos, Latinas, and how they are transforming U.S. Catholicism, the U.S. Catholic experience. Secondly, we'll look at, I have named the second part as a tale of 2 communities, and who gets to tell the tale. So I'll say a couple of remarks in that regard. And finally, a little bit of looking into the future. How does this data help us to look into the future, and what analysis that we have been provided say for us in order to either shape the way we are ministering to Latinos, or at least begin a new wave of reflections in this regard. Also, I want to share with you that before coming to this response, I consulted some of my Latino theologian colleagues in different parts of the country. I sent them the information, asked them to read it, and give me some feedback, So in a sense, it's a little bit of teología de conjunto or collaborative theology, some of these remarks. And most of the ideas are mine, but I borrow some of their insights. So here we go. Insights that I think are helpful, and we also need to take as a foundation or a starting step. The church's growth in the United States during the last 4 decades has been mainly the result of Hispanic growth. We know this, about 70% of the growth of Catholicism in this country is because of the presence of Latinos, both through immigration and secondly, a high birth rate. On average, Latino families have 2.5 children. On average, non-Latinos have 1.5 children. I have always wondered how do you make a 0.5 child, but there you have it. Nonetheless, even though the growth of the church over the decades has been because of the Hispanic presence, Hispanic Catholics are still living in the margins of church and society. Still we read histories of Catholicism in the United States, and Latinos are a footnote or just 2 or 3 pages. In terms of leadership, Latinos are still in the margins of the life of the church. There are more than 240 bishops in the United States. Only 31 are Hispanic. In terms of priests, the number is very small. So we still, Latinos, despite the fact that we have a lot of numbers, their participation in the life of the church is still on the margins. Same thing in society. Also, Hispanic Catholicism is continuously perceived as an addendum or a problem nationwide. In many places, we speak of the Hispanic problem. We speak of the Hispanic reality as something that we will pay attention to if we have time. So that, in a sense, does not correspond to the growth that this survey is signaling. Second, Hispanic Catholicism has an enormous potential to renew Catholic life or to renew the church in the United States. We have seen it through the data that's been revealed, how Catholic attitudes among Hispanics, in some sense, connect deeply with what has been traditionally considered Catholic identity. It is noted also that there are some other aspects that need to be taken into consideration when defining this Catholic identity. Yet, Hispanic Catholic spiritual traditions are still, are largely misunderstood, suspect, or ignored in many places. For instance, popular Catholicism in many sectors of the church is considered as superstitious or as the spirituality of those uneducated Catholics. So theologians, Latino theologians, as a matter of fact, have been countering that argument for decades. It is through Hispanic Catholicism, and beyond the official celebrations of the church, sacramental celebrations, it is through Hispanic Catholicism that most Latinos in the United States experience and relate with God. And that's an important aspect, and not every expression of popular Catholicism is superstition. Now, it is important also to notice that Catholicism, or Euro-American Catholicism, mainstream Catholicism, after the Second Vatican Council, largely moved from traditional devotions and practices, not totally, but largely from many of these. And in a sense, Latinos are bringing back some of these expressions that are important for Catholic identity. Also, Latina Catholics, despite the fact that there is an enormous potential in terms of their growth and presence, there is still a large expectation that Latinos need to assimilate to the 20th century Euro-American model of migration. So the idea is that Latinos, by the second generation, will drop Spanish and eventually will drop some of these traditions that their parents brought with them. But that is not happening, and there are many factors, sociological, historical, religious factors for which that is not happening, cultural as well. Another insight that we can gain from this study is that about half of all millennial Catholics in the United States are Hispanic. That, in a sense, is telling us that the future habla español, speaks Spanish, And this is a metaphor not because these young men and women are actually going to speak Spanish as a language, but they are going to see Catholicism and shape Catholicism through the Latina experience, through Hispanic eyes. So having noticed that, we also need to keep in mind that very few resources nationwide are invested in Hispanic youth ministry, in leadership development, and educational initiatives that benefit Hispanic Catholics. In other words, if we know today that Latinas are the present and the future of Catholicism in the United States, we are not doing enough to invest in that present and future. And we are doing that, at our own risk as a church. There is also limited understanding of who young Latinas are. Ken Johnson Mondragon from Instituto Fe y Vida in Stockton, California, which is an organization that specializes on Hispanic youth ministry, as a matter of fact, has named this for many years. And one of the biggest mistakes that we do in ministry and in our analysis of Latino Catholicism, particularly Hispanic youth, is that we pretty much take Hispanic youth as an equivalent to Euro-American or mainstream youth. And that's not always the case. So there is a need to reconsider some categories. Johnson Mondragon proposes 4 categories that are important for us to keep in mind as we seek to understand Latino Catholicism in this country. He says that about 40 to 50% of Latinos, young Latinos, jóvenes, which is the word in Spanish, Hispanic youth, are identity seekers. These are the young women and men who live in the in-between. They're mostly second and third generation, and they are not fully Latinos, like the immigrants, like their parents who are immigrants, yet they are not fully assimilated into the mainstream culture. So there's a unique way of understanding themselves in ministry, or particularly youth ministry, oftentimes dismisses or ignores this reality. There is a second group that's called the mainstream movers, 20 to 30%, and these are the young Latinos who don't want to bother about maintaining language and culture. So in a sense, these are the Latinos, Latinas who choose to assimilate into the mainstream culture. And as I read the survey and about all the information about the millennials, it seems to me that most of the young people who responded to this survey are in this particular group. You know, that will be my sense of the data. I don't have the surveys, I don't have all the data, but it would seem to me that these are mostly the people and perhaps some of the identity seekers. Immigrant workers, in the data and the analysis here, that's a group that we don't hear in this particular project. Now, 10 to 20% are immigrant workers, young women and men who leave Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, South America at the age of 12, 13, 14, 15 to come to the United States and work. They have their own particular needs and they have their own understanding of life and the Catholic experience. And finally, there's another group that is a very large group among Hispanic and Hispanic Catholics as well, and it's gang members and high-risk teens. So that population is large. 10 to 15% of these Latinos are in this particular group. Many of them are as the category says, are gang members, but many are imprisoned, many live in poverty. So as I was saying, I think that it's important for us to acknowledge that Latino youth is the present and future of Catholicism, in large part, present and future of Catholicism in this country, but we need to look at the different categories, And one last insight, Catholic education makes a difference in the education of Hispanics. Amen. Yes, it makes a huge difference in terms of graduation rates. It makes a difference in terms of socioeconomic positioning. It makes sense in terms of access to a better life and social mobility. Yet, only 3% of school-age, Hispanic school-age children in the United States attend Catholic schools. If we know that there is such a huge impact in the life of Latinos, the church in the United States still is doing very little to help Latino families send their children to Catholic schools. Only 3 years ago, the University of Notre Dame led an important study on Latinos and access to Catholic schools. And they discovered, their analysis was that this 3% is very concerning, yet there are about 600,000 empty seats in Catholic schools nationwide that could perfectly be used to invite Latino families to come and educate their children. So when this morning you were presenting the data about Catholic schools and the waiting lists, I was actually surprised, at seeing, comparing that piece of data that actually it was Mary, So when Mary was talking about waiting lists, and on the other hand, there is this study saying more than 600,000 empty seats in Catholic schools. And because those empty seats are not filled, many of these Catholic schools choose to close. That's a huge challenge. 3 major transitions in contemporary Catholicism then emerging from this data. On the one hand, we are quickly shifting from a Euro-American, mostly pattern of Catholicism to a culturally diverse, primarily Hispanic model of Catholic experience. That's going to be the Catholicism that we are going to see and face in the first part of the 20th century. There is also a social transition. And this social transition, we're seeing a Catholicism which is mostly middle class, particularly after the 1940s until today, to a Catholicism that is primarily working class, or we can say, use the metaphors from the suburb to the barrio. No, that's a transformation that's happening. And in terms of leadership, which we haven't discussed that much in this conversation, there is a transition from more professional, charismatic type of leadership, no, the leadership of the ordained, the highly educated laity, to a kind of leadership, where we have the communities, developing some forms of leadership, but unfortunately, because of the lack of, the low levels of education that Latinos have in this country, they cannot access the opportunities of formation for lay ecclesial ministry. Those are big challenges. And again, as I said, I'm reading the data and I'm asking myself, what can we do with this data to move forward and help the church better serve the Latina community? So here we are, a tale of two communities. Who gets to tell the tale? When I share this information with other colleagues from different parts of the country, something that was almost unanimous among them was, in this analysis that we read, is that we had the minority in the United States telling the story about the whole church. And the minority here is not Hispanics, as a matter of fact. The minority here, numerically, is, in a sense, the mainstream culture, the Euro-American culture, no? So there are some numbers that we need to keep in mind. Now, the question of demographics, no? The survey suggests that about 33% of Catholics in this country are Hispanic. However, Latino scholars, Hispanic scholars nationwide estimate that actually that number is much higher. That 33% has been the number that's been used for almost 15 years. And that would mean that there hasn't been any growth. But as a matter of fact, the growth is very clear. And we see that particular growth in the Southwest, where dioceses like San Bernardino, Fresno, Orange, 80 to 90% of all Catholic population is Hispanic. And we continue to see growth in the Southwest, and it's already happening in the Northeast and in the Northern Diocese. The Archdiocese of Chicago, for instance, way far from the border, from the southern border, the Archdiocese of Chicago is almost, if not more than 50% Hispanic by now. So huge changes. So also, it is estimated that 55% of all Catholics under the age of 18 are Hispanic. Numbers matter, my friends. Numbers matter because with numbers come the allocation of resources. And that happens in politics, and it happens in the life of the church. So when Latinos claim and actually move into the conversation about these statistics, we are always saying, let's keep in mind that, for instance, allocating resources in Fresno, California, it's not the same as allocating resources in Boston, Massachusetts, when we speak of Hispanics. So we need to make that differentiation. Though also, we can raise the question of Latino-Latina identity. Usually in the surveys and the sociological studies, social science studies, we speak of Latinos as one body, But yes, that's how the data is collected in many cases. But we need to keep in mind that in the Latina community is a very complex reality. It's a very complex community in terms of language, in terms of culture, socioeconomic location, in terms of perspectives, histories. So not one size fits all. And in the analysis of this data, we always need to keep in mind this complexity. And that's a difficult challenge. Approximately 63% of all Latinos, Latinas were born in the United States. And we need to keep in mind that sometimes when we read the data, what comes to our minds is the immigrant population. As a matter of fact, in most places throughout the United States, when one speaks of Hispanic ministry, whether at the diocesan or parish level, Hispanic ministry is primarily defined as ministry with those who are Spanish-speaking. Yet, we know that the majority of Latinos are English-speaking. That doesn't mean that they do not speak Spanish. The majority of Latinos in the United States speak both languages. So language, culture, religiosity, or the religious experience, social location are very important. And as we read this important data, this helpful data, my invitation to you is that we also keep in mind that the data needs to be filtered through those particular lenses as well. The question of who comes to church, this is an important one. The survey offers data about Catholic Latino Latinas that do not or does not necessarily coincide with the pastoral experience, And this is something that emerges constantly in surveys of this kind, So the Latinos that are portrayed in a survey like this one, most of this is a population that more likely we do not see in many of our parishes. Nationwide, most of the Latinos who come to church are immigrants and are first generation and are Spanish speaking. Those are the majority. So models of ministry in the United States have been divided into, there are two main models of ministry when it comes down to the Hispanic community. On the one hand, we have the model that serves primarily those who are Spanish-speaking or Hispanic ministry, as I mentioned. And then there is the mainstream model, the one that with which most of us are familiar. But the group that's being described in this survey, and this is somehow one of the observations that I make along with some of my colleagues, is that the group that's described in this survey somehow falls through the cracks in the process of ministering, in the process of pastoral programs and allocation of resources. So this group exists, and actually this group may be larger than we imagine, but that's not the group that in pastoral practice we are seeing in our communities. They are not the ones on many occasions who are coming to church. And in general, I already said this, Hispanic ministry is defined primarily as ministry with immigrants, mostly in Spanish, and most second, third generation Latinos fall into what I would call a limbo, even though the International Theological Commission said that limbo doesn't exist anymore, so we don't talk about limbo. Latina concerns. Not always the concerns of the mainstream Catholicism are those of Hispanic Catholics. A lot has been said today about autonomy, about sexual ethics, and so forth. Some of those are certainly concerns of Latinos, but when one goes to the different communities, the churches, and as a matter of fact, because of the work that I do as an academic and also as the director of graduate programs in Hispanic ministry here at Boston College, I get a chance to visit different parts of the country and speak with hundreds of leaders in Hispanic ministry, and it is just great to see that it's interesting to see that many of the concerns are a little bit different. So each generation and each culture bring different concerns, and I don't have to say more on this. Keep in mind that ideological positioning in mainstream Catholicism not always is the same, or there's an equivalent in the Latina community. Catholicism, mainstream Catholicism in the United States, unfortunately, has been wounded by the divide left, right, conservative, liberal, whatever those words mean in every context. However, many Latinos coming to church, practicing their faith, have different concerns. And as theologian Ada Maria Isasi Diaz says, most Latinos are in a survival mode in this country. Poverty, high rates of teenage pregnancy, almost half of the prison population in this country is Hispanic. So we have lots of challenges, and that's where many Latinos are. There are many also who are participating of the ideological positionings, but let's keep in mind that there are other resources because of the location in which they are. And also, Latinos are highly concerned about the transition in which we are going, because by being the majority in terms of numbers in many places, that requires that Hispanics need to become leaders of their communities, but not leaders just for the Latina community, but leaders for the whole church. And as a matter of fact, if it came to wishes, I would have loved to read more in the analysis about how this survey affected African Americans, or what it revealed about African American Catholics, Asian American Catholics, just as we did with mainstream Catholics and Hispanic Catholics. So to conclude, looking into the future, Catholicism in the second decade of this century, I think that by looking at this survey and many other instruments of analysis that we have of our reality, should lead us into investment in Hispanic Catholic youth and young adults. If we are going to put our money, we are going to bet into the future of Catholicism in this country, we need to start looking truly and sincerely at this particular group. That's a group that in many places has been ignored, and in many places is not receiving the necessary attention. Secondly, this morning was also mentioned, the issue of evangelization and catechesis. And I mentioned catechesis, I'm a professor of religious education here. So catechesis is a very important aspect. Last year, the Pew Religion did a study on religious literacy, and they presented their data in a form of a triangle, in a form of a pyramid. On the top of the pyramid, the group that best knows its religious beliefs are atheists and agnostics. They know what they don't believe. But those who are at the bottom of the pyramid, Hispanic Catholics. And that's why we need a new evangelization, borrowing the words of John Paul II and now Benedict XVI. And next year, there's going to be a whole synod on this particular topic. So there is a huge need in this regard. Leadership development at all levels. I already mentioned this. Just to give you one example, for instance, more than 85% of Latino priests in the United States were born in Latin America. They were born outside of this country. The question is, what is happening to the Latino community that is born and raised in this country that is not fostering vocations to religious life, to the priesthood, and to lay ecclesial ministry? Those are important questions that emerge out of surveys like this one. And finally, we need to pay attention to the questions that Hispanic Catholics are asking. I'll give you one. Immigration is an urgent question at this point. About 10 million Latinos, Latinas in this country are undocumented. But not only that, about 20 million Latinos who are immigrants do not have access to health care, do not have decent jobs. They are immigrants. So immigration is an important reality. A bishop from California, was advocating for immigration reform as part of the USCCB campaign, Justice for Immigrants. And he noticed that the state representatives who were part of his diocese were voting against everything that smelled immigration reform. So he went to them because they were Catholic, and they told him, "Bishop, we are with you. We are pro-immigration reform, but the people who are writing the letters are your own Catholic. The Catholic people are the ones who are writing the letters against us, and they are the ones who elect us. They are the ones who vote for us. So you get your act together, and we will vote, pro-immigration." And that's what's happening. The Latinos are asking some important questions that are not the questions just of Latinos. They are the questions of the church. Wishes for the next survey, 2017. There is a promise. I was reading that, I think that Mary wrote in one of her essays. So there are promises there's going to be a next survey. Here is what I wish for that survey. That we are able, this survey looks at Hispanic Catholics in their various experiences, and that those experiences be reflected in the data and the analysis as much as possible. That the formulation of the questions are mindful of language, culture, and experience, not only of Latinos, but also of Asian Americans, Africans, and many others who are coming into this country and are part of the fabric that constitutes the church in the United States. that involve Hispanic scholars developing the survey and analyzing it. I think that we are at a point where Latinos need to be at the drawing table rather than coming afterwards. Work in partnership with Hispanic organizations and faith communities that are already asking these questions, and we will do much better. And finally, differentiation according to regions. I think that's very important. It's not the same to speak about Hispanic Catholicism in California, New Mexico, Arizona, as to speak of Catholicism in New England, in the New England states. It's two different worlds, two different realities, but sometimes we just use Catholic, Hispanic, and by summarizing everything, it becomes a little bit troublesome. Boston College is doing something in this regard. We are adding to this conversation. We just launched a national study of Catholic parishes with Hispanic ministry for 2 years, and we want to look at 3 aspects. On the one hand, we want to look at the impact of Hispanics in parish life and what models of ministry are emerging. In the United States, 1/3 of all parishes, more or less, have some form of Hispanic ministry, defined as ministry in Spanish, something done in Spanish. So it's about 5,000 parishes, and we are attempting to study this. We want to know who are the leaders in these communities, and also how religious education is done. So there's a lot of work, and I take this survey as a challenge to me, but also to the church in the United States. Thank you.
I'd just like to comment. So thank you very much, Dr. Ospino. I think, again, I haven't much to disagree with, but I think what it raises is really methodological issues. So I'm somebody who does survey research, but I also do qualitative case studies. And in an ideal world, you could do all of this kind of research because the world is very complex, and Catholicism is certainly complex. But anytime you do a survey, you are getting a large snapshot of a large population. So everybody is getting short shrift. I'm surprised that somebody in the audience already hasn't stood up and said, oh, well, Catholics in Newton are different from Catholics in Wellesley. How can you group them together? Because it's true, Catholics in one parish here 2 miles from one down the road are different. And they're all Euro-American, high, white, upper professional Catholics. So there's a lot of variation. But we're just getting the big picture, maybe it's not the big picture, but a picture of a large set of Catholics. And so you're always collapsing difference. And in sociology, we talk about intersectionality, that gender, race, class, location, all of these interact in everyday experiences, and they do matter. But if we are to keep remembering that, we'd never do any research because it's too complex, and we end up having to write data and write results, and you have to end up collapsing people into groups. So I don't say this in a defensive way. I think it's just a limitation. If we had more money and more time, we could certainly oversample. One of the actual advantages of this study is that it is including an oversample of Hispanics. Typically, and in the past, why Hispanics haven't been given more inclusion is because there weren't enough of them to gather into a national sample. A probability sample that assures equal representation to everybody has to be about 1,200 to 1,500 people. So that's a very small absolute number. But obviously, if you're from a smaller minority within the culture, your chances of getting included are less than if you're in the mainstream. And so that's why, for example, we oversampled Hispanics, and why today we didn't talk about the other, we talked about non-Hispanics. They were largely white because there's such a tiny percentage of African Americans and Asians in our sample, and more generally in American Catholicism. So it sounds even disrespectful to them to have not included them and talked about them, but that would have demanded other oversamples. So that's sort of a methodological, so I don't mean it as it's not a defensive response, but it's actually a methodological limitation of doing survey research. On the other hand, if I came and presented a study of a case study of one parish, you'd say, oh, that might be true of that parish, but it's not true. Right. And so I think that's good to raise these issues. Numbers matter, but the problem with numbers is the census already is an undercount, because we know precisely with Hispanics, because there are so many illegal Hispanics, that people don't want to fill out the long or the short census forms. And then even those who do fill them out, we know, unfortunately, we don't ask religion. If we could ask in the census, what is your current religion, then we'd have a wonderful set of data. So I agree with all that you say in terms of looking at the difference within group. But I think this is a good first sort of slice at the national level, and I think then your pastoral study and talking to pastoral leaders hopefully will give a lot more of that variety.
There's one item that we forgot to mention. I don't think we mentioned it at all in our discussion, but which is in the methodology, and that is that for the first time, we conducted our surveys in English and in Spanish, and a large percentage of the interviews with Hispanics were in Spanish. This provided us, and the survey was constructed by a person of Mexican descent. So insofar as she reflects whatever percentage she did, the survey certainly was not a problem. No problems were raised with regard to the structure of the survey in Spanish. It seemed to be well received. That's a first step, but it's an important step. And it's the first time we've been able to carry that out. So we consider it a major accomplishment. Right.
One interesting comment just on this question of the numbers and how things are measured and how it makes a difference. We've done a fair amount of not so much experimentation, but we've employed different methodologies at Pew in terms of counting people and counting people's religion and counting people's religion by ethnicity. And it's really interesting just how important the language that you offer people in which they can complete the interview, just how important that is in terms of the numbers that you come up with. If you conduct an interview as a survey, as our colleagues at the Pew Hispanic Center do, with all using a staff of interviewers that's made up entirely of people who are totally bilingual. So they call you up on the phone, and at the drop of a hat, they can switch from English to Spanish and back and forth. If you do that kind of a survey with completely bilingual interviewers, you find that something like 2/3 or more of Hispanics describe themselves as Catholic, 68, 70%. If you take a middle approach, better than an English-only survey, but not as good as a completely bilingual staff of interviewers, and you conduct most of your interviews in English, but when your English language speaking interviewer gets a Spanish speaker on the phone, they make a note of it, and that person is called back by a Spanish-speaking interviewer. If you take that approach, you find that something like 6 in 10 Hispanics describe themselves as Catholic. If you do a survey in English only, it's something like half or fewer of Hispanics who are Catholic. And this speaks to the question of assimilation and to the question of, it speaks to just how important the way you count really is. You'll get a dramatically different picture if you have an English-only survey as compared to an English with the Spanish option as opposed to a completely bilingual survey. So you're certainly right that the way these things are done, the methodology employed makes a big difference in the results that you wind up with.